going to get started with a new project here in this folder. Let's do that. Actually, where do I click to make a new project? Do I make a new? Oh, I guess I just use this create button over here. And so when I get started with this programming project, I'm going to do the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript default, just like we did for our website project. But we're actually going to leave the JavaScript file in there, and we're going to edit it. So I'm just going to call this programming intro and create our replit. And so when we create a regular replit or a new template file, usually what we get out of the box are these 3 files. And we already know what a couple of those files are because we've just covered them. Our index.html is our default HTML page. The style.css is our default style sheet. But this third file, the JavaScript file, we haven't talked about. And this actually doesn't have any template code in it. And we'll see how we can start to add some stuff in there. But there's a couple things that are built in here that kind of make it easy to get started. So if we run this and open a new tab, we can see what this kind of default looks like. It just has this text here, and it has this like replit badge down here, which I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of. So let's just delete that. But it has this line here, which we have not seen before, which is a script tag. And it may look a little bit familiar because it has a similar syntax to a image tag. So you can see we have, instead of image, where we would have like img for image and then source for the image source, we have script to attach a script, and then we have the same src, and then we have a reference to the name of the file in our files section. And so JavaScript is the third language, along with HTML and CSS, that most websites are based on. JavaScript is a relatively new programming language. It was developed in the 90s by the people at Mozilla who make Firefox and other web tools. It kind of was around a little bit earlier than that, but that's who developed most of it. But JavaScript has become an incredibly popular programming language. So if you look at any sort of like, if we look at like the Stack Overflow annual report or developer survey, I don't know why I just randomly did 2019 by mistake. Let's just do a regular one. Okay, so if we go to any one of these surveys from recent years, you're going to see in most popular technologies, JavaScript is, it says here, JavaScript continues its streak in the for the 11th year in a row as the most commonly used programming language. So you can see 63% of people professional developers use JavaScript. So you could argue about whether or not it's the best language, but you can argue about whether or not it's the most used language. So it is very popular, and it became very popular because the web became very popular. So when it first existed, people didn't really like it very much for a lot of different reasons, which I may go into a little bit. But it's become very popular on the web, and for people who are first learning to program, it's very easy to use because it's built into your browser, so you don't have to learn how to build an application or compile your code. You just write the code, you refresh your browser, and the browser runs it for you. So it's very nice to learn as far as that goes. So let's design a little bit of content here, and we're going to interact with our JavaScript. So one of the things that JavaScript is used for is to add functionality to a web page. So websites have text and images, which we can display, which we can do in our HTML. They have styles and layouts and colors, which we can write in our CSS. But most websites, especially these days, have some way of interacting with them. So you can log into them, you can post content on them, you can upload your images. So websites do all of these different things. And to do those types of more advanced functionalities, we need to use a more classical scripting language, and JavaScript is the language that we tend to use for that. So what we'll look at right now is a few basic HTML elements that we haven't talked about before, which are user interface elements, or things that a user can interact with. And so I'm just going to add a few of these as examples, and then we'll look at how to connect them in our JavaScript. So we could imagine creating sort of like a sign up page for a user. I'm going to make a little container div just in case I want to add some styles later. So I'm going to say div ID equals container, and then I'll close that div. And then I'm just going to add a couple different UI elements. So I'm going to start with a paragraph, and we'll prompt the user to add a username. I'm just using this as kind of an example. We'll probably do something else when we do our Mad Lib project. And we will ask them where they're from. We'll say, where are you from? So I'm just adding these little paragraphs. And then we'll have a button to submit. And so in the add your user name in here, I'm going to use what's called an input. And an input, there's a lot of different types of inputs, but the default input is a text input. And so I'm just going to add an input here. And all I really have to do is say input, and you'll see that what we're going to get when we reload the page is one of these boxes where you can type stuff. That's really all an input is. It's pretty straightforward. We can add some style and design it, but for now we're just going to focus on our JavaScript. One thing that we're going to do to make this easier to interact with is to give it an ID. So just like we can use IDs to select elements in our CSS, we can also do it in our JavaScript. So we'll give this input an ID, and we'll call this user dash name. Another thing is that there's a lot of different naming conventions in programming. There's various reasons for why those conventions arise. I tend to use the most sort of generally accepted conventions, but they're not always the best. So I'll try to talk about why I'm using them as I use them. But this is just a convention for HTML. We use lowercase letters, and we use dashes between words. That's just an HTML convention. Okay, so we're going to ask our user to add a username. Then we're going to ask them where they're from, and we're going to use a different type of input for this. For this one, we're going to use something called a select. And this is a drop-down that gives us multiple options. So we'll make a select, and inside of our select, we'll have some options. So we'll say, we'll give them the boroughs of New York to select. So we'll start with Bronx, and we'll say Brooklyn, and we'll say Manhattan, and Staten Island, and Queens, and let's add New Jersey as our final option. Okay, so now when we refresh our page, we have a little drop down and we have some options. So there's a couple things here. So we want to again add an ID to this select. So we'll say ID, and we'll call this user location. So that'll allow us to find this when we write our code. And then with the options, you can actually change the value if you want to. So for example, I could say value. Let's say I had like a shorthand for these different things, like maybe I just have BX for Bronx or something like that. I could actually change the value of the option. If I don't have a value, it'll just default to what's ever in here. So let's just leave it there for now. Okay, so then the last element we're going to add down here is a button. So I'm going to actually put a paragraph here to separate everything. And then I'm just going to put a little button. And inside the button, I can put some text that says submit. So this will be kind of, our general sort of like form. Didn't show up for some reason. There we go. So I can click that button and submit the information on the page. So this is just an example again. When we do a Mad Libs thing, we'll add different options for inputting stuff, but we're just going over the basics for now. And so now we need to add an ID for our button. and we'll say submit as the ID. You might also say something like submit button. It depends on how many different options you have on the page. You might need to differentiate from different things, but submit should be good for now. So I think that's all the HTML that we need. And so now we can move over to our JavaScript page. And today we're just going to make something very simple that just sort of gets this content. Actually, let's make one more thing. We can just give a response to the user to show that we've gotten the content. So I'll make a paragraph here, but it's not going to have anything in it. So we'll just give it an ID, and we'll add text to it later. So we'll say response. Okay, so that's our markup, and now we want to edit our script. So to do that, I'm just going to open up script.js, and I'm really just going to kind of go into some basics. There's a lot of different things. People have a lot of different opinions about how we should set these things up, but I'm not really going to do anything fancy. I'm just going to kind of dive right in. So when we're writing JavaScript, there's a few different types of text that we can add. One is comments. So if I put 2 slashes like this and say this is a comment, that's not code. It's text that we can add to write notes, to make suggestions, to remind ourselves. It's just notes, essentially, that we can save for ourselves or for other developers. We can also write comments like this. This is a multi-line comment. And with multi-line comments, they don't end until we put the opposite. So we start with a / asterisk, and we end with an asterisk /. In our code, the comment will always be a different color. In Replit, it's green. Depending on what editor you're using, it might be different colors in those editors. Okay, so usually in a comment, we'd have some text explaining what this does. What's that? Sorry, there's like a banging noise. Can we not do that? Thank you. Okay. So let's add a little bit of context to what is happening here. So we're going to say this is a demo to create a user input form. You might put who it's by, you might put the date, you may put some other information about resources that you use to create it, anything that would be necessary to understand the code that we're about to read. So most code starts with some type of comment that kind of talks about what the point of the code is. Okay. So another thing that we can do in our code is we can talk to our developer tools. And I'll use this for an example just to show something that we can do in JavaScript in the browser specifically. So there's a thing in the browser called the console. I'll open this up and show you guys what it looks like real quick. So if I go to the browser and I go to my developer tools, usually in the past couple classes, we've just been looking at this Elements tab where we see our HTML, and down here we see our CSS. In the console, this is where we can interact with the JavaScript that is running on the website. And so I can type things in here and it will execute JavaScript. So this obviously isn't something that most users would use, but this is something developers use basically to write messages to the output, to test things, to see if there's errors. And so we'll see errors in here if we write errors. So I can type stuff in here, like I can type in terms like document. Document is something that JavaScript uses to be able to communicate with the HTML and CSS. So if I type in document and I hit enter here, you can see all the HTML. So JavaScript kind of has this like representation of what is there in the HTML. The console is the thing that we're in. So if I type console, you'll see that there's all these different things we can do with the console. And one of those things we can do is we can log stuff. So if I say console.log and then I put some parentheses, I can log whatever I want into the console as a developer. So I can say hello there, and it's going to log that into the console. So if I do something like that in my script, we'll see that the script is running. So if I say console.log and I say hello, you can see that hello shows up in the JavaScript console. And it even shows us where it's coming from in the script. It says script.js and it says line 8. And so we can actually see where in our code this happens. If we have errors, so if I do something like forget to write a quotation mark and I try to run my website, I'm going to get an error. And so when I'm making a website, I always want to have this console open so I can see when there are errors in my script before I notice that the script is broken. So sometimes you'll just be working and something won't work the way you think it is, and then you'll remember, oh, I have to open up this console, and there it is. We have the script. So we can see errors or mistakes that we may have made. So as a developer, when I'm working on a website, I basically always have the console open so I can see errors and issues before they happen. Okay, so let's actually start to interact with our HTML page. So one of the things that we need to do to get started is if we want to know what's happening on the HTML page, we have to know how to get a reference to it. And the way that we do that is by storing references to parts of our HTML in something called a variable. So this is one of the kind of most basic parts of programming. A variable is just like a nickname for some aspect of our application. If we want to create a variable, there's a few different ways we can do it. The most basic way is to use var, which is short for variable. And then we give the variable a name. So if we look at our HTML and we want to get the user name, we can call our variable something like user name. Here's the first point where we'll talk about the difference in syntax. In HTML and CSS, we tend to use dashes. That's just a convention. But in JavaScript, I'm not allowed to use a dash here because it actually means minus in programming languages. You can do math in programming languages. So most of the symbols that represent math operations are not allowed to be used for variable names. So in JavaScript, instead, we use something called camel case. This is where if we have two words, we capitalize the second word. It's called camel case because camels have humps. If I had a third word, I'd have another hump if I called this like username input. But the first letter is always lowercase. This doesn't change the functionality of the code. This is just a convention for how we write the code so that people know what's going on. Okay, so we've created a variable, and now we are going to assign something to that variable. So to assign something to a variable, we use an equal sign. And then in JavaScript, we can use that thing I was just showing you guys, this thing called the document, to reference parts of our HTML. So if we say something like document and then a dot, the dot is going to show us everything that's inside this document. And there's a lot of different ways that we can find things in our HTML. If we search through here, you can see there's a lot of different functions that do different things. But the one that we're going to use is this one called getElementById. That allows us to choose a specific element from our HTML. So if I put in username here, it gives me a reference to that component in our document. So I'm going to write that into my script. I'm going to say document.getElementById. You can see that Replit is familiar with JavaScript, so it's going to give me some helpful suggestions as I'm writing my code. So if this is the right thing that I'm looking for, I can hit enter and it'll fill it out. And then I add these parentheses again. This is just something that goes along with a function like getElementById to give it a specific value. So this one is user-name. So this is one sort of like statement or line of JavaScript, and there's a lot going on in there. So if this seems confusing, that's not unusual. Most people learning programming for the first time will not understand everything that's happening here. But we kind of have to, when it comes to programming, you kind of have to learn everything at the same time because everything is kind of interacts with each other. So we have now this username input, and I can log this just to show that it exists. So I'll just say username input. And so now if we look at that, here you can see in my code script.js line 9, we have username input right here. And by getting a reference to the username input, we can know what the user has written inside of the input. And that would be the value. So we haven't gotten quite to that point yet, but we will soon. So let's get references to the other components of our HTML. We have the user name, the user location, and we have our submit button, and we have our response section. So we have 3 more things that we want to reference. So I'm going to delete this log. And I'm just going to repeat this exact same process, but I need to change the name of the variable. So no 2 variables can have the same name. So I need to make different variable names. And then I need to make sure to change this ID to match the element that I'm looking for. So you could write this out, or you could copy and paste. Either way is fine. I'm going to create a new variable on the next line. And for this variable, I'm going to get the user location. So I'll say user location input. I'm using kind of long variable names. You don't actually have to make them super long, but it makes it easier to understand exactly what I'm referencing. For the user location input, I'm going to say document.get element by ID. I was waiting for Replit to finish it for me, but it doesn't want to. That's okay. This will be user-location. So now I have 2 more. I have my submit button. And this is document.getElement by ID. JavaScript tends to use long names like this. So this one is submit. Also notice that each one of these lines ends with a semicolon, sort of like our CSS does. This just tells JavaScript that the line is over. These are actually optional. JavaScript is similar to HTML and CSS, that it'll kind of fill in stuff for us. So if you forget a semicolon, your code should still run. Basically the same. There are some very rare cases where it may break your code, but most of the time it doesn't really care. But it's still good to add it as a syntax thing. So then the final variable we need is our response. So we'll say response equals document.get element by ID response. So again, this is a lot of new things. So we'll keep talking about what each one of these things means. But hopefully you'll see the pattern that's emerging in the way that we reference these elements. And then as we use the elements, you'll probably see more patterns that will happen as we learn more JavaScript. Okay, so let's log those guys. We can see what they look like. So we have our username input. We have our user location input. Notice that I can log multiple things by just putting a comma in between those things. We have our submit button, and we have our response. So if we refresh here, now we can see our JavaScript knows where to find the username input, the location, the submit button, and the response here. So now we have basically everything we need to be able to record the user input and then get a response. So I'm going to put a little note here on what's happening here. Get references to the HTML elements. Okay, so now we need to know when the user has submitted the information. So that is when the user clicks here. So this is another topic in programming. This is called an event. And in our JavaScript, we can use code to look for events that the user writes or that the user does. So to do this, so we're going to look for a user click on the submit button. So what we can do is we can take our submit button and we can use another JavaScript function. So when we add a dot to the end of something, we can put a function to that object. And if you're not sure what something can do, we can run our code here. So once we run this and we see, let me take out this line of code first, because that's an error. notice that now I have access to these variables that I created in my script, so I can put that into my console. And then if I say submit button and then I put a dot at the end, it'll show me what the various different functions I can run on this submit button are. So there's a whole lot of them. We don't need to know all of them. I'm just going to go over a couple. So if I want to know when my user has clicked on the submit button, I can say submit button.add event listener. This is a specific thing in my code that's just going to keep running and looking to see if the button has been clicked. So it's going to check over and over again until that click occurs. In the event listener, in my parentheses over here, there's two things that I need to specify. One is what type of event I'm looking for, because there's different ways that the user can interact with my document. So the event I'm looking for is a click. And the next thing I need to say is what I want to happen after this click occurs. And so for this, there's a lot of different ways to do this, but the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to create a function. And a function is like a variable in that we can create a nickname for something, but instead of a specific part of our page, what a function is a series of other statements in our code. So for my submit button, I'm just going to make up a function name. I'm going to say user, or I'm going to say input handler. So an input handler is basically just saying that this function handles the input from the user. So then I'm going to create that function. So to create a new function, we're kind of jumping into a lot of different topics, but we will come back and go over in more detail. To create a function, I just use the word function. So instead of var or var for variable, I just use function. And then I give the function a name just like I did my variables. So for this one, I'm going to give it input handler. And then a function always has parentheses at the end. So just like the parentheses that are here, we always have a function with parentheses. And then after the parentheses, we have brackets, like we have in CSS, that specify the area where we put our lines of code. Okay, so when we get our input, we're just going to, for now, just log a couple things. So I'm going to say console.log our user name input, and console.log our user location input. So it should log both of those elements when I click the button. So when I click submit, notice that anytime I click that, so it'll do it multiple times, anytime I click the submit button, we'll see those two elements logged over here. But what we really want to know is what the user has put in those two elements. So instead of username.input or username input, we'll say username input.value. And instead of user location, we'll say user location input.value. So this will tell us the actual value that our user has recorded here. So if I just click submit, I haven't written anything for this first box. We'll talk about how to make the user do that, but for now, let's put something in here. So I'll put my name and put Brooklyn. And so now we see the user's input. So now we can actually do something like that with that. So the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to take those values and we're going to use them to log a response to the user to show that we successfully took their input. So I'm going to make something called a string, which is a series of texts, and I'm going to put those values in there. So to do this, I'm going to take my response. Remember, my response is that empty paragraph, and I'm going to set the text content of that response. So I'm going to say response.textContent. Notice the camel case. Text is lowercase, content is uppercase. This is just the text that's inside of that paragraph. And then I'm going to set it to a value. So I'm going to set an equal sign. Excuse me. And first, let's just write a string. So I'm just going to say hello, and then name from location. So we're going to fill in name and location with our variables in a second. But for now, let's just see that that works. So I click submit, and now that text appears in my document. So we can respond to user input by adding new content onto the page. Okay, so now let's fit these values in there so we can actually put that new content. So to do that in a string, there's a few different ways to do it, but the easiest way to do it is we actually have to change from quotation marks to this thing called a backtick, which is, you probably haven't used this before, but it's the button on the very left of the numbers, and it just looks like that. That's called a backtick. So it's the number next to the number, or it's the character next to the number 1. And what this does is it allows me to put variables inside my string using a specific syntax. And that syntax is a $ and then quotation, and then curly brackets. You see a lot of weird stuff like this in programming, but eventually you'll get used to seeing these things. So I can replace the name with the value that the user has put here. And I can do the same thing with location. I can put a $ and some quotation and some curly brackets, and then I can put the location value there. And so this is the end of our short intro. Now, if I put my username here, and I put my where I'm from here, and I click submit, now our program knows who my user is, and it knows whatever information I've put in here. So we can use JavaScript to take information input from the user on our web page, and then change various parts of our web page or change the output of what we put. So if I want to change the name, if I want to be named Jenny instead of Owen, we'll see that that input will change. If I want to be named Jerry, that input will change. If I want to change my location, that input will change. So this is a very basic overview. We're going to go into a little bit more detail on all of these topics over the next couple weeks. But hopefully you can start to understand the reason why we need to use programming when we're building a website, and also start to see some of the patterns that you'll see in the syntax here. But it's probably going to be a little bit confusing at first. It's going to take some time and working with it. So we do have a couple more classes, and we'll go into some more specific details and start to build our Mad Libs application from this this basic programming approach. Okay, so I'll save that, and I'll post this code along with the video.